The Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a Chief Compliance Officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This month, it's Susan Divers. In episode 2, Susan moves to the corporate world in-house. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Susan Divers, Director of Thought Leadership at LRN, for another episode of The Compliance Life. Susan, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom. It's always a pleasure.
Susan, in today's episode, we wanted to take a little bit deeper dive into your professional career in-house. You told us how in the 90s you'd moved to SAIC. Could you tell us a little bit about the role you were hired to do?
Sure, Tom. Well, I was the first lawyer on the East Coast. SAIC had a legal department on the West Coast, but their McLean office was becoming a real center of gravity. And secondly, I was hired specifically to specialize in international, and that was very broad. That included anti-corruption, sanctions, export control, which was a big deal for SAIC. But it also included setting up subsidiaries abroad, working on governance issues in different countries, and somewhat remarkably, supervising litigation. And so I dabbled a lot. Dabbled is the wrong word. I worked a lot on employment litigation in our different operations around the world. So I liked it because it was sort of one of the less generalist practices. Although sometimes it made you want to tear your hair out because there was always a new issue coming up, and you'd have to learn something about French law or whatever.
What was the business of SAIC?
SAIC was a tech company, and its motto was science through solution, solutions through science. And it had a premier name as a system integrator. So a lot of our work was for the U.S. government. And when I joined, that was probably 80%, but some of that involved overseas FMS and other overseas activities. But then there was a real push to build up the commercial side. And I think the business, I'm active in the Alumni Association, but I don't remember what the mix is now, but it's much more commercial. They were much more successful. And that was just getting underway when I was there, where they were, trying to attract commercial work. And one of the first pieces of that work was IT outsourcing for major oil companies, both in the UK and in Venezuela. And I worked on both of those projects extensively.
Did you travel overseas extensively as well?
I did. At one point, I wound up commuting monthly to Venezuela because I was the secretary of the board of our joint venture there. And in another instance, I was going to Scotland monthly because we had some issues with another outsourcing partner who was located in Scotland. And then I went everywhere else as well, it seems.
Did you go to Aberdeen?
I did. I liked Aberdeen a lot. Although this client was headquartered in Glasgow, which is different, but I came to really like
Very
Glasgow
different.
too. Yeah. And then later on, my sons and I went to the Western Isles and did sort of 2 weeks of island hopping, where you start in Glasgow and you go out from there.
Yeah, I've been to the Western Isles. The Isle of Skye is just gorgeous. I spent 2 weeks on the Orkneys once, so I really enjoyed that too.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. I haven't been to the Orkneys. Yeah, we actually wound up on Islay in the middle of the Malt Scotch Festival, which we didn't know was going on. And my sons were very happy about
I
that.
bet they were. So, did you report to the general counsel, or was there a CCO or CECO at SAIC at that time?
There wasn't. I reported to the general counsel, but I had a dotted line to the executive vice president, who was also a lawyer who oversaw all the administrative side of the business. We didn't have a CECO until just as I was leaving.
So, what was it like, sort of building a anti-corruption compliance program, a trade sanction compliance program, and doing all the things that we assume a CCO or CECO does, really from scratch?
It was from scratch. On the one hand, and then I did pretty much the same thing when I went to Aecom. On the one hand, Greenfield is very exciting, and you can set it up the way you think it should operate, and it's very creative. And I like big projects, and I like seeing things through to fruition. On the other hand, it's a lot. So particularly at SAIC in those days, the culture was very democratic. And in fact, when I came, people said to me, one of the good things about working here is no one can tell you what to do, but one of the bad things is you can't tell anyone else what to do. So when we were getting our export, we had our first priority was to get our export control program up and to get it scaled throughout the business units, because they were all doing different things and sometimes competing against one another. And so there was a lot of persuasion involved, of going in and sitting down and talking to senior leaders and explaining why this was really something that we had to do, rather than something we just simply should do. And then building that infrastructure out and building my own team at the same time, so that I had people who were business friendly and could speak the language that my business partners did, but could also, give tough advice when we had to give tough advice.
I'd like to ask you about your work in Venezuela, specifically around PDVSA. Really, up until Chavez, PDVSA was I'm not sure what the right word, certainly friendly towards American companies. And I was at an oilfield service company, and we had very close business relations with PDVSA. And I found that this was a sort of turn of the century. Their lawyers were very professional. They represented their client, but they were not antagonistic. They worked very hard to put contracts in place that had some equity, not full equity, because they were the national oil company. But I was wondering if you could say a few words about working with PDVSA and in Venezuela in the 90s, as opposed to what happened after Chavez came on board and since then, in terms of business relations between U.S. and Venezuelan companies.
Well, I'm actually glad you asked that question. The short answer is it was a tragedy, because when our joint venture got underway, I think it was like maybe 2000, PDVSA had a reputation which it deserved, as far as I could tell, for being the gold standard in terms of professionalism and expertise and having a good employee culture, and being immune to corruption. And we had a joint venture where we took over their IT outsourcing, and it was called Intesa. And I think it was 50-50, if I remember, or maybe it was 60-40. But at any rate, once Chavez came in, the whole thing shifted, and it shifted pretty dramatically and quickly. After about a year, we started really seeing direct interference in some of the things we were doing, where there'd be pressure to have a directed subsidiary, a directed subcontractor, or other problems. And at the time, we had a very good board, and I was the corporate secretary, so I was there for all of the board meetings. But even the board started feeling the pressure. And eventually, Chavez targeted Intesa after the coup against him by the military. And we were the first company expropriated, but we had armed thugs in our office taking computers and taking cars, and the employees were terrorized. And we essentially, in the end, had to declare force majeure. And then we had an overseas private investment corporation insurance policy against expropriation, fortunately, and we fully recovered under that because it was a total. There was a finding. The State Department actually, I think, made the finding that it was a total expropriation, and that was a very stressful experience to go through, particularly as the joint venture had been highly successful. And I think it was in the 90s, the number of 90% and above of our employees owned SAIC stock. And SAIC was an employee-owned company. So that was a very big deal. So it was watching something that was really excellent and working well, then just go completely destroyed, just about.
You mentioned an organization, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. In the oilfield services industries, we're huge fans of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. It got some bad press 10 years ago or so. But I was wondering if you could say a few words about your perception of the function of that organization and really how it supports U.S. businesses overseas.
I wonder if it's well known now, because in those days it wasn't. We had a really excellent risk director at SAIC. And he was the person that pushed to have expropriation insurance in place. And so he really deserves a lot of the credit for the protection, for the recovery that we made under that. And my experience with them was that they really did serve an important function, and they gave people some level of risk mitigation when they were operating in very difficult places. At the time, we didn't know Venezuela would turn out to be as challenging as it did, but it was a good thing that we did have that insurance policy.
And that was frankly the thing that I couldn't understand when there was the congressional brouhaha over it, because the way my company always used the Overseas Private Investment Corporation was as a backstop. They were never on the front line. Yeah. It had to be 1, 2, or 3 things had to happen before you'd even consider going to them or filing a claim, and they really were just a distant but important risk management tool. So I'm glad I got to talk to somebody who actually was able to utilize their services.
And I agree with the way you characterized them. Yeah, they weren't frontline. They were the backstop.
In our next episode, we're going to go into a deep dive into your work at Aecom as CECO, but I wanted to maybe set it up by asking you what led to your move to the CECO chair at Aecom from SAIC?
Well, I left SAIC when the founder left, and then pretty much all the people I worked with over the 13 years had left, the ones that I was very close to and that supported what I was doing. So it was a changed landscape and a changed culture. And I left at a good time. And so then I briefly worked at Lockheed for PAE, but then I thought about what I really wanted to do. And one of my friends who was a headhunter called me and she said, I have a chief ethics and compliance officer job that I think you'd be perfect for. And I thought, gee, I really have been a chief ethics and compliance officer. And, I had set up the program at SAIC. And so the next thing I knew, I was the chief ethics and compliance officer at Aecom. And it was a wonderful experience.
Well, that seems like a good place to end this episode, Susan. But before we leave, I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or any of the topics we've touched on. What would be the best way for them to get in contact with you?
Probably my LinkedIn profile. I like directing people there because it's where I post a lot of things that I'm writing. But I'm also easy to find at LRN if you just go on the website.
Susan, thanks again, and I look forward to finding about your move to the CCO chair in our next episode.
Sounds good, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you'll join me again next week where I take up another episode in The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.